Wang Zhihuan, Climbing Crane Tower. The white sun vanishes at the mountain top. The yellow river is swallowed by the sea. Wanting to see 1,000 miles farther, you climb one more flight of stairs. Okay, so it's been a long time since we have last come upon a poet that we didn't encounter before in this collection. Wang Zhihuan is one of these cases. This is the first of two poems of his in the collection, so two shouldn't place him in the highest of leagues. But there's one aspect in which these two poems are very representative of Wang Shihuan's works. Only 6 poems of his have survived till the present. So the 2 poems included in this anthology are, they're 1/3, they're more than 33% of his entire production. So, funny anecdotes aside, Wang Shihuan, even though a relatively minor poet, was pretty famous for his poetry. I'm pretty sure I've read a different version of this poem in some anthology. And the next poem of his, which we will encounter much later, I think it's a heptasyllabic quatrain. So the next poem of his is pretty famous because of an anecdote associated with it in 2 other poets, but we'll explain that when we get to that one. So a few pieces of information about Wang Shihuan. He was born in 688, a native of Jinjiang in the north of the country, from Taijuan. And because his father was a district magistrate, he managed to enter the civil service like Du Fu had by means of protection privilege. That is to say, some sons of people who were in the bureaucracy managed, even without the examinations, to be allotted minor postings in it. So he had different posts. He traveled widely around China, and he gained a fame as a swordsman. In about 732, he spent some time traveling with Gao Shi, a poet we've encountered before, one of the famous Tang poets, especially for his frontier poems. And later in life, he served as district defender of Wenan, which is a pretty modest cursus honorum for Wang Shihuan. I mean, the post of district defender is even smaller than county magistrate. But anyway, he had a good reputation because of his fairness at that post. And he died in 742. And as I said, only 6 of his poems have survived. So this poem is about climbing Crane Tower. We've seen different poems about climbing Yellow Crane Tower, but this is a different one. It seems this Crane Tower was located at Heizhong, near present-day Zhongji in Shaanxi, on the shores of the Yellow River. It was a 3 stories high construction with magnificent views of the Yellow River, of course, and of the Chongtiao Mountains. Now, like all poems about climbing, whether it be mountains or hills or towers, and we've commented this many times before, you might not remember because it was some poems ago when we last have a poem of this subgenre of the climbing the tower. But a very common streak in this is the connection with the traditional Chinese belief, or metaphor, if you will, of associating the physical climbing of a high space and the geographical, the visual insight that elevated places generate with a more, how could we say, another meaning of insight, where insight is a synonym of knowledge. So there's this idea that climbing elevated places not only gives you a greater view of your surroundings, it somehow also helps create a greater degree of knowledge, of wisdom about your surroundings. It expands your mind just as it expands your sight. And this is a common trope in Chinese culture. Probably is connected with Taoism, with this idea that we would later assume of going to high places, seeing nature, or the experience of flight and looking at the countryside below with humans little more than ants on the landscape. This detachment from the social, from the human realm, which can be attained when you are in a high elevated place. This is a common trope in as I say, in Taoist philosophy, but you could extend it to other schools. In fact, this happened. This idea of the ruler, for example, the king, the emperor, as the person who sees without being seen, as a kind of pre-panopticon eye, very typical in the histories and the chronicles. So anyway, here we have a climbing of a tower. I imagine this crane tower wasn't actually that high. It's a wooden construction, so it would pale in comparison with our modern skyscrapers. But the same feeling that one might get, the same dizziness and height, and contemplating the abyss and the extending landscape is probably what would have been felt by a poet and by any other person of the Tang Dynasty climbing one of these constructions of the dynasty, which were state-of-the-art and extremely elevated for their time. And this poem is all about it. This is a poem about climbing a tower, and you don't really get that philosophical part, at least not very explicitly, of the insight that the poet gains by the climbing, but you do get a hyperbolic image of just how incredibly high, how stunningly high this tower rises, and how ambitious the poet is to enjoy an even greater view. So that would be the topic, really. The topic is climbing a high structure, being the hyperbolic description of the height, and the desire of the poet to climb even higher, his ambition in this instance, but it can be taken as a metaphor for probably for greater and other ambitions. So a very short poem. Let's take a look at the couplets. First couplet. The first couplet is especially descriptive. It basically hyperbolizes the height of the tower through two images. The white sun vanishes at the mountain top. The yellow river is swallowed by the sea. So the poetic persona is climbing the tower. We might imagine that he might have stopped at some sort of a flight of stairs or a balcony at a certain level in the tower, and he looks out. What does he see? So first of all, the sun, the white sun, vanishes at the mountain top. So there's no specification about the time of day in the poem. White sun vanishing in the mountains, it might be close to evening, so the sun might indeed be setting and disappearing amidst the mountains in the background. But I get a hyperbolic, as I mentioned previously, a hyperbolic image here. Like, this tower is so high that it looks down on mountains, which are so high that they are tall enough to blot out the sun. So I would say this is the image, really. This tower is so incredibly high that even the sun in the sky is reduced to something down there, hidden by the mountains, which are at the same or lower height than this tower itself. And the second line, I favor this interpretation because of the second line. The yellow river is swallowed by the sea. So the idea here is that the poet, from his balcony, from the middle of the tower, looks at the Yellow River and can see all the way the thousands and thousands of miles of the course of the Yellow River until it reaches the sea. Now, this would have been absolutely impossible from this specific crane tower. I mean, where it was located, the distance from there and the Yellow River at that place and the place where it joins the sea, I don't know. It's probably the distance between, A Coruña and Britain. It's an enormous distance. So it's impossible. I think it's completely impossible to see the sea from that area. So these are hyperbolic images. The extension of sight in this tower is so big you could see the sea from here, and you can look down at the sun hidden by the mountains. So incredible height, incredible dizzy height. This tower almost touches the heavens. Second couplet. Wanting to see 1,000 miles farther, you climb one more flight of stairs. So the second part goes from what is seen to what is felt by the poetic persona and what he does. So in spite of this awe-inspiring, striking sight, it's not enough. The poet wants more. Everybody would want more in his position. So wanting to see even further, expanding the insight, one climbs to the top, one more flight of stairs, perhaps to the next flight, perhaps to the top flight of the structure. So the elevation and the insight will become even bigger, in the lines that might continue but do not, and which are left to the imagination of the reader. So, pretty short poem, like all the pentasyllabic quatrains in the section, but I'd say a pretty effective one. I think it conveys pretty well the spirit or the intentions that I feel the author might want to convey, even in a translation, which, as you well know, causes such a loss of formal and linguistic aspects, but quite a nice piece.